When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the scale of the invasion exceeded every previous military campaign in European history. 3 massive army groups, North, Center, and South, rove across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their objective was not merely territorial conquest, but the complete dismantling of the Soviet state before winter arrived. German planners assumed that the Red Army would collapse within weeks, that Soviet industry would fall into disarray, and that the political system would disintegrate under the pressure of rapid mechanized assaults. Early successes seemed to confirm these expectations. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and vast territories lost in the opening months. Yet despite these catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. What emerged instead was a protracted industrial and logistical struggle, one that the Soviet Union could not have sustained alone. As the front moved deeper into Soviet territory, the Red Army suffered from acute shortages of trucks, locomotives, high-octane aviation fuel, radio equipment, rubber, aluminum, food supplies, and basic industrial materials. While Soviet factories were being dismantled and transported eastward, the United States began delivering the first components of what would become the most extensive wartime aid program in history. By the winter of 1941, even before the United States entered the war formally, Lend Lease shipments were already flowing into Soviet ports. The initial phase of Barbarossa revealed a structural imbalance between German operational capabilities and Soviet logistical capacity. The Red Army's retreat stretched supply lines to the breaking point. The rail network was damaged, locomotives were destroyed or captured, and the remaining infrastructure struggled to move reinforcements and equipment across vast distances. Without a reliable system of transport, even well-equipped formations could not sustain offensive or defensive operations. This is where U S Lend Lease support began to shape the battlefield, not through dramatic battlefield weapons, but through the quiet, continuous movement of essential materials. American trucks, most famously the Studebaker models, became the backbone of Soviet mobility, enabling the Red Army to move artillery, ammunition, fuel, and troops quickly across shifting fronts. During the critical battles near Moscow in late 19, the Soviet Union faced one of its most precarious moments. German armored divisions approached the outskirts of the capital, threatening to break through the final defensive lines. Temperatures dropped sharply, roads froze, and the logistical capacity of both armies was severely tested. The Red Army, lacking winter clothing and motorized transport, struggled to reposition fresh units arriving from Siberia. U.S. shipments of winter boots, blankets, and insulated clothing arrived just as Soviet forces prepared for the counter. These supplies did not win the battle, but they enabled Soviet soldiers to fight under conditions that would have otherwise caused severe attrition. Another decisive contribution came in the form of aviation fuel. Soviet aircraft engines required high-octane fuel for maximum performance, particularly in the harsh winter air, where engine efficiency declined rapidly. U.S. refineries produced aviation fuel in quantities and purity levels that Soviet industry could not match during the opening stages of the war. This fuel allowed Soviet fighter units to maintain operational tempo and provided essential support for the defense of Moscow. Without it, Soviet air operations would have been severely restricted at a moment when air defense was critical to preventing German breakthroughs. As the front stabilized near Moscow, the Red Army began reorganizing its shattered formations. Soviet industry, relocated to the Urals and Siberia, slowly resumed production, but shortages persisted across every branch of the military. American shipments of aluminum, copper, steel, and machine tools were essential to restarting Soviet industrial output. These materials supported the construction of tanks, aircraft, and artillery systems that would later be critical in battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk. In many cases, US machine tools became the foundation of entire Soviet factories, enabling mass production to continue even as the war expanded. Rail transport presented another critical challenge. German offensives had destroyed thousands of locomotives and railcars, and the Soviet railway system was unable to move supplies efficiently across the vast distances required by frontline operations. American shipments of locomotives and rail equipment engineered for rugged conditions helped repair and expand Soviet rail networks. These locomotives hauled fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to frontline sectors, helping to sustain Soviet offensives and stabilize defensive positions. The ability to move resources rapidly became one of the defining advantages of the Red Army as the war progressed. At the same time, food shortages plagued the Soviet home front. Massive agricultural regions were occupied by German forces, and millions of civilians faced starvation. This crisis threatened not only the civilian population but also the soldiers at the front, whose rations were often inadequate. US shipments of canned meats, sugar, grains, and concentrated food supplements provided critical sustenance for Soviet troops. These shipments ensured that frontline units received consistent nutrition, enabling them to operate under extreme conditions during winter campaigns. Throughout the first year of Barbarossa, German intelligence consistently underestimated the impact of Lend Lease. German reports focused on Soviet production figures, failing to account for the logistical and material support flowing from the United States. As a result, German planners believed that Soviet strength was the result of endless manpower reserves rather than a combination of industrial reorganization and foreign aid. This miscalculation contributed to the continued commitment of German forces to extended offensives that their own logistics could not sustain. By early 1940, the Eastern Front had reached a point where the survival of the Soviet state depended not only on battlefield resilience but on the continued flow of supplies. U.S. Lend Lease aid, though still in its early phases, had already prevented several logistical collapses. It filled critical gaps in transport, fuel, food, and industrial materials. These contributions did not replace Soviet industry, but they enabled it to operate under conditions that would otherwise have caused systemic failure. The Red Army's capacity to remain in the field depended on a logistic foundation strengthened by American shipments. By the spring of 1940, the scale of the logistical crisis on the Eastern Front forced both the Soviet Union and the United States to intensify cooperation. The Red Army was rebuilding after catastrophic losses, but every major component of its supply system remained under severe strain. Factories in the Urals were producing weapons at increasing rates, yet production alone could not solve the deeper structural problems of transport, fuel, and industrial materials. U.S. Lend Lease shipment, initially modest, expanded rapidly through Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arch, as well as routes through the Persian Gulf and the Soviet Far East. These supply lines formed the backbone of a transcontinental logistical network, unmatched in its complexity. One of the most transformative elements of this network was the continued influx of American trucks. As Soviet commanders prepared for summer and autumn operations, mobility became an essential component of strategic planning. The Red Army needed to move entire armies across hundreds of miles to reinforce endangered sectors or exploit breakthroughs. Yet the Soviet automotive industry was unable to build vehicles in the quantities required. American trucks, primarily Studebaker, Dodge, and Ford models, filled this gap. They were rugged, simple to repair, and capable of operating in the harsh terrain and climate of the Eastern Front. By late 1942, these trucks were not merely supportive assets, they became the logistical arteries of the Red Army. Artillery units used them to haul guns, logistics units used them to deliver ammunition and food, and mechanized formations relied on them to sustain rapid movement. A less visible but equally critical component of Lend Lease support was radio and communication equipment. The Red Army entered the war with significant deficiencies in battlefield communication. Many Soviet units lacked reliable radio sets, and coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was often achieved through runners, signal flags, or prearranged signals. This system was insufficient for modern mechanized warfare. U.S. shipments of radio equipment dramatically improved Soviet command and control. Units could coordinate movements more effectively, respond to developments faster, and synchronize multi-division operations. This improvement in communication played a decisive role in later Soviet offensives, where large-scale maneuver required tight coordination across wide fronts. Industrial materials delivered through Lend Lease were equally vital. The Soviet Union needed aluminum for aircraft, copper for electrical wiring, rubber for tires and track pads, and machinery for factory production. U.S. deliveries of machine tools, precision instruments, and raw materials provided the foundation for expanded Soviet manufacturing capacity. Many Soviet aircraft, including fighters and ground attack aircraft, used aluminum sourced largely from American shipments. Electrical systems across tanks, trucks, and radios depended on copper imported through Lend Lease channels. Without these materials, Soviet industrial output would have stagnated at the levels of 1941. Unable to expand to meet the demands of prolonged warfare, food supply remained another critical problem. Agricultural losses were severe due to German occupation of fertile regions and scorched earth tactics employed during retreats. Civilians and soldiers alike suffered from shortages that threatened the stability of both frontline operations and the home front. U.S. shipments of processed foods, particularly canned meat, flour, sugar, and dried milk, helped stabilize Soviet rationing. These supplies enabled the Red Army to maintain reliable field kitchens and sustained caloric intake during long campaigns. The contribution of American foodstuffs became especially notable in 1942 and 1943, when Soviet agricultural output had not yet recovered and rationing remained strict. The Persian Corridor, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, became one of the most critical supply routes during this period. U.S. engineers, working alongside British and Soviet personnel, expanded ports, railways, and highways to facilitate the rapid movement of supplies. The corridor operated year-round and remained far less vulnerable to German interference compared to Arctic convoys, which faced constant threats from U-boats, aircraft, and severe weather. Through this route, vast quantities of vehicles, fuel, and materials entered the Soviet Union, sustaining operations at points thousands of miles from their place of origin. On the battlefield, German forces continued their drive into southern Russia, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of St. These operations further strained Soviet logistics. The Red Army needed to move large formations across immense distances to defend critical sectors. Lend-Lease trucks played an indispensable role in these movements. Soviet tank armies, which would later spearhead major offensives, relied heavily on American vehicle fleets to transport ammunition, fuel, and infantry support. Without a mechanized logistics system, Soviet armored thrusts would have remained tethered to railheads and vulnerable to German counterattacks. The Battle for Stalingrad exposed the limits of German operational endurance and the growing strength of Soviet logistics. As the Red Army encircled the German Sixth Army, Soviet formations used Lend-Lease vehicles to transport supplies across the steppe, sustaining the tightening ring around the trapped German forces. American radios facilitated coordination among units maneuvering in harsh winter conditions. High-octane aviation fuel kept Soviet aircraft flying at a high operational tempo, providing air cover and reconnaissance during the While Soviet courage and leadership were decisive, the logistical capacity supported by U.S. aid ensured that the encirclement could be maintained through weeks of bitter fighting. German intelligence again underestimated the impact of these logistical improvements. Reports described increased Soviet mobility but attributed it solely to Soviet production. The idea that the Red Army was increasingly motorized due to foreign aid did not align with German preconceptions about Soviet capabilities. This miscalculation contributed to continued German offensives. In late 1942 and early 1943, operations that assumed Soviet forces lacked the logistical flexibility to execute multi-front counterattacks. In reality, US Lend Lease had already given the Red Army the tools necessary for rapid movement, operational coordination, and sustained supply. By early 1943, the character of the Eastern Front began to change. The Red Army had survived the initial onslaught, stabilized the front, and delivered a major strategic defeat. However, these achievements depended not only on Soviet industrial recovery but also on the consistent flow of American supplies. Lend-Lease trucks, fuel, radios, machine tools, locomotives, and food formed the invisible infrastructure behind every major Soviet operation. Without this support, the Soviet Union might have been able to resist, but would have lacked the capacity to launch large-scale counterattacks. The logistical transformation initiated by Lend-Lease set the stage for the next phase of the War, in which Soviet forces would increasingly take the initiative. By mid-1943, the cumulative impact of US Lend-Lease support had begun to transform the operational capabilities of the Red Army. The shift was subtle at first, emerging not through dramatic battlefield victories, but through improvements in mobility, communication, and logistical endurance. These enhancements became fully visible during the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored engagement in history, and the subsequent Soviet offensives that pushed German forces westward, while Soviet factories were producing tanks, guns, and aircraft at remarkable rates. The ability to move, supply, and coordinate these forces depended heavily on American trucks, radios, industrial materials, and fuel. During the Kursk campaign, the Red Army's defensive preparations required the construction of extensive fortifications, minefields, anti-tank zones, and artillery. The movement of materials, engineers, and labor forces across wide areas relied on extensive motor transport. Lend-Lease vehicles ensured that Soviet command could rapidly shift reserves, position artillery, and deliver ammunition during the prolonged battles. When German armored spearheads attempted to break through, Soviet mobile reserves responded swiftly, made possible in part by the increased availability of reliable trucks. Although Soviet tanks were of domestic design, their ability to reach the battlefield in strength owed much to the logistical backbone provided by American vehicles. The importance of U.S. communication equipment also became apparent during these operations. Coordinating forces across the vast depth and width of the Kursk salient required dependable radio networks. American radio sets, known for reliability and longer operational ranges, improved command and control at multiple levels. Soviet units could respond more quickly to German movements, execute counterattacks with greater precision, and maintain cohesion under heavy pressure. The improved communication infrastructure supported coordinated artillery barrages, air support, and armored maneuvers, essential to the eventual Soviet victory in the engagement. Another element of Lend-Lease aid that shaped the battlefield was the supply of specialized machine tools and industrial equipment. Soviet industry had partially recovered after relocation, but expansion required advanced machinery that could produce precision components for tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery systems. American machine tools filled critical gaps, enabling factories to operate more efficiently and at higher capacity. This industrial support contributed indirectly to Soviet battlefield strength by increasing the flow of domestically produced weapons and equipment. The combination of Lend-Lease materials and Soviet production created an industrial synergy that allowed the Red Army to grow stronger as the war progressed. In the aftermath of Kursk, the Red Army began a series of major offensives across the Eastern Front, retaking cities such as Kharkov and Kiev. These operations required large-scale movements of men and materiel, often across terrain still damaged from earlier battles. Lend-Lease trucks played a crucial role in these maneuvers, transporting infantry, towing artillery, and delivering supplies. German forces, increasingly reliant on horse-drawn transport due to fuel shortages and industrial decline, could not match the speed at which Soviet units redeployed. This disparity in mobility allowed Soviet commanders to maintain operational momentum, preventing the Germans from establishing stable defensive lines. American food shipments continued to support both the Red Army and the Soviet civilian population. Rations became more reliable, and frontline units received consistent supplies of high-calorie foods essential for sustained operations. The difference between being adequately fed and operating on minimal rations profoundly affected morale and physical endurance, especially during protracted offensives. The importance of Lend-Lease foodstuffs was often overlooked in discussions of military aid, but their impact on Soviet operational endurance was undeniable. Fuel remained an equally critical component of Soviet operations. Soviet industry could produce aviation fuel, but not in the quantities or octane levels required for modern air warfare. U.S. shipments of high-octane fuel enabled Soviet air units to maintain a high sortie rate, providing air cover, reconnaissance, and ground attack operations in support of advancing armies. This fuel also powered training programs that produced new pilots at a rapid rate, ensuring that losses could be replaced without diminishing effectiveness. The presence of reliable aviation fuel contributed directly to the increasing efficiency of Soviet air operations during 1943 and 1944. Locomotives and rail cars supplied through Lend-Lease also became essential. The recapture of territory meant that rail infrastructure had to be rebuilt or repaired quickly. American locomotives, known for their durability and power, allowed the Soviet Union to move resources efficiently across vast distances. These locomotives supplemented the damaged domestic fleet, enabling the transport of entire armies, large quantities of supplies, and heavy equipment. As the Red Army advanced, railways became the primary arteries connecting frontline units with industrial centers in the east. The German army struggled to adapt to the increasing tempo of Soviet operations. Their divisions, weakened by earlier losses, lacked the fuel, vehicles, and manpower necessary to counter multiple Soviet offensives launched across wide sectors. German reliance on static defenses and horse-drawn logistics made rapid redeployment nearly impossible. In contrast, the Red Army's use of mechanized transport, much of it supplied by the United States, allowed Soviet commanders to execute deep operations designed to penetrate, encircle, and destroy German formations. Throughout Soviet offensive operations revealed a pattern. German lines would hold initially, but once Soviet breakthroughs occurred, German units could not retreat fast enough to avoid encirclement. This operational dynamic was impossible without a logistical system capable of sustaining high-speed advances. Lend-Lease transport vehicles gave Soviet commanders this capability. The Soviet concept of operational art, which required integrating large-scale movements of armor, infantry, and artillery across vast distances, became fully viable once adequate mechanization was achieved by the end of 1943. It was evident that the strategic balance on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The Red Army no longer operated on the brink of collapse, but had emerged as a powerful, mobile force capable of launching sustained offensives. German intelligence reported increased Soviet mobility, higher operational tempo, and improved coordination, but continued to underestimate the role of Lend-Lease aid. This ongoing misjudgment contributed to strategic errors that would become even more costly in the coming year. As preparations began for the major campaigns of 1940, Lend-Lease shipments reached unprecedented levels. The United States delivered thousands of additional trucks, tanks, aircraft, radios, food shipments, machine tools, and industrial materials. The Red Army entered the new year with greater logistical capacity, deeper mechanization, and more dependable supply lines than ever before. The stage was set for the largest Soviet offensives of the war, operations that would push deep into German-occupied territory and ultimately bring the war to the gates of East Prussia and beyond. The Red Army launched a series of massive coordinated offensives across the Eastern Front, operations that required an unprecedented level of logistical support. These campaigns, stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea, were not merely tactical engagements, but enormous strategic maneuvers involving millions of troops, tens of thousands of vehicles, in vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and food. The ability to sustain these offensives depended heavily on the backbone of transport, communication, and industrial support, strengthened by years of U.S. Lend Lease aid. As Soviet force concentration grew, so too did the demand for the very materials, tools, and vehicles that Lend Lease had supplied. One of the most decisive operations of this period was Operation Barbarossa, launched in the summer of 19, designed to destroy the German Army Group Center. Bagration became one of the most catastrophic defeats Germany suffered during the war. The Soviet plan required rapid breakthroughs, deep penetration, and swift exploitation by armored and mechanized formations. The mechanized exploitation phase, essential to preventing German units from reforming their defenses, relied heavily on motor transport. It was during this phase that American-supplied Studebaker trucks demonstrated their full strategic value. Soviet tank armies, once limited by scarce domestic transport vehicles, could now maintain operational tempo over vast distances. Artillery and infantry support units kept pace with armored elements, allowing breakthroughs to expand into deep encirclements. This increased mobility allowed Soviet forces to execute complex maneuvers across wide sectors, trapping and destroying German divisions before they could retreat. German units, bound by rigid command structures and constrained by chronic fuel shortages, were unable to regroup or counterattack effectively. The contrast in mobility between the two sides was dramatic. German units often relied on horse-drawn logistics and fragmented supply lines that could not keep up with the demands of mechanized warfare. The Red Army, benefiting from thousands of American trucks and an increasingly motorized supply system, advanced at speeds that repeatedly outpaced German expectations. Air support also played a critical role in these offensives. Soviet air units, operating with high-octane aviation fuel, supplied largely by the United States, maintained a high sortie rate that provided reconnaissance, ground attack, and cover for advancing ground forces. The availability of dependable fuel enabled Soviet aircraft to operate consistently, even during periods of intense combat. This fuel was particularly important for ground attack aircraft, which required powerful engines capable of sustained low-altitude maneuvers. Without high-quality aviation fuel, Soviet air support would have been limited in both duration and effectiveness, reducing the pressure placed on German defensive lines. Industrial materials delivered through Lend, copper, aluminum, rubber, and machine tools continued to underpin Soviet weapons production. As frontline operations expanded, the Red Army required increasing numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, self-propelled guns, and aircraft. American industrial materials allowed Soviet factories to maintain high production levels even as the scope of the war grew. Many components essential to Soviet vehicles and equipment, from electrical systems to specialized alloys, relied on resources imported from the United States. These materials ensured that Soviet production remained steady despite the intense demands of continuous operations. The importance of Lend Lease locomotives and rolling stock also increased. During 1944, as Soviet forces liberated territory, they encountered rail networks heavily damaged by retreating German forces. To sustain the advance, engineers had to repair or rebuild hundreds of miles of railways. American locomotives, built for durability and ease of maintenance, became essential for moving heavy equipment, supplies, and reinforcements toward the front. These locomotives helped restore long-distance logistical connections between Soviet industry in the east and the rapidly advancing armies in the west. Without this restored rail capacity, the Red Army's ability to sustain large-scale operations would have been severely constrained. Communication equipment supplied through Lend Lease further strengthened Soviet operational capabilities. Radios and field communication systems enabled more precise coordination among units, especially during fast-moving offensives where battlefield conditions changed rapidly. Soviet commanders increasingly relied on these systems to synchronize the actions of multiple armies. This improved coordination contributed directly to the success of operations, such as the liberation of Belarus, the advance into the Baltic states, and the drive toward Poland. In many cases, the ability to coordinate movements across vast distances allowed the Red Army to encircle German forces that attempted to withdraw along limited road networks. As Soviet offensives continued, the German army faced worsening shortages of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and manpower. German production could not match the combined output of Soviet industry and U.S. industrial support. The logistical disparity between the two sides became a decisive factor. German units, often reduced to a fraction of their nominal strength, could not respond to multiple Soviet breakthroughs. Their retreat was hindered by the lack of motorized transport and constant pressure from Soviet forces. In contrast, the Red Army's increasing mechanization, supported by Lend, enabled, sustained, pursuit operations that prevented the Germans from forming stable defensive lines. Food supplies also played a critical role in maintaining Soviet operational tempo during this period. American canned meats, grains, and other foodstuffs provided reliable nutrition to Soviet troops, especially during long offensives where domestic supplies were limited or disrupted. These imports reduced the strain on the Soviet agricultural system, allowing the Red Army to focus on combat operations rather than food shortages. The consistent availability of rations supported morale and endurance during physically demanding campaigns. The cumulative effects of Lend-Lease had fundamentally altered the strategic balance on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had evolved from a force struggling to survive into a mechanized army, capable of sustained offensive operations across thousands of miles. American trucks enabled rapid advances. American radios enhanced command and control. American aviation fuel sustained air operations. American machine tools expanded industrial production. American locomotives strengthened strategic mobility. American food supported frontline troops. Together, these contributions created a logistical platform that the Soviet Union alone could not have built during wartime. As Soviet forces advanced into Eastern Europe, the German army retreated toward its borders, increasingly unable to counter the depth, speed, and coordination of Soviet operations. The transformation of the Eastern Front from a battlefield dominated by German initiative into a theater defined by Soviet operational superiority marked a turning point in the war. This transformation was rooted not only in Soviet sacrifice and industrial effort, but also in the vast and continuous support provided by the United States. By the final months of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, the Eastern Front had been transformed beyond recognition. What began as a desperate Soviet struggle for survival in 1941 had become a sustained, coordinated advance into the heart of German-occupied Europe. This transformation rested on three pillars: Soviet resilience and sacrifice, Soviet industrial relocation and recovery, and the massive logistical foundation provided by U S Lend Lease. The Red Army approached the borders of East Prussia and moved toward the Vistula and Oder rivers. The scale of Soviet operations reached levels that demanded a stable flow of supplies far beyond what domestic production and infrastructure alone could provide. The final campaigns, leading to Berlin, required immense quantities of ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, communication, equipment, and transport vehicles. Soviet offensives spanned hundreds of miles, often involving multiple fronts acting in concert. These operations demanded an ability to sustain offensive pressure for weeks at a time, without pause, across terrain devastated by years of war. American trucks, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, formed long columns carrying supplies to frontline units. They transported artillery shells, fuel drums, bridging equipment, repair tools, and infantry reinforcements across roads that would have been impassable for vehicles of lesser durability. The Red Army's operational depth depended on this motorized backbone, which was overwhelmingly Lend-Lease in origin. In addition to motor transport, the strategic movement of entire Soviet armies depended on locomotives and railcars supplied under Lend. As Soviet forces advanced westward, engineers restored, captured rail lines using U.S. equipment and components. These restored railways allowed Soviet command to reposition tank armies and shock armies rapidly, enabling them to maintain momentum even as the front shifted. The German army, increasingly dependent on a dwindling and fragmented rail system, could not match this mobility. US locomotives, built for rugged performance, hauled thousands of tons of supplies daily, ensuring that Soviet headquarters could keep their armies supplied regardless of distance from industrial centers. Food and essential consumables continued to flow into the Soviet Union, supporting both frontline troops and civilians in liberated territory. American shipments of canned meat, flour, powdered eggs, and other rations became a stable source of nutrition, freeing the Soviet agricultural system to focus on long-term recovery rather than immediate wartime demands. This consistent food supply maintained the endurance and fighting capability of frontline units during the demanding winter operations of 1944 to 1945. Without these imports, the Red Army would have faced significant strain as its operational pace accelerated. High-octane aviation fuel remained one of the most vital components of Lend-Lease aid. Soviet air operations in 1945 required a high tempo to support ground offensives, interdict German supply lines, and maintain air superiority over key sectors. U.S. fuel allowed Soviet fighter and ground attack aircraft to operate continuously even during intense operations. The availability of this fuel ensured that Soviet air units could provide reconnaissance and close air support essential to breakthrough and exploitation phases of the offensive. German air power, by contrast, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self due to fuel shortages and heavy losses. The Luftwaffe could no longer challenge Soviet aircraft effectively. American industrial materials, copper, aluminum, rubber, bearings, and machine tools continued to support Soviet production until the very end of the war. As Soviet forces advanced, factories in the Urals and Siberia ramped up output of tanks, aircraft, and artillery at unprecedented rates. Many of the machines used to produce these weapons were of American origin. Electrical components in Soviet tanks and trucks relied on copper imported from the United States. Tires and track pads were made possible by American rubber shipments. Aluminum from U.S. sources became essential for the production of aircraft frames and engines. Without these materials, Soviet industrial capacity would have struggled to meet the demands of the rapidly expanding front. Communication equipment delivered under Lend-Lease allowed for reliable command and control across vast operational zones. Radios made it possible to synchronize multi-army offensives, coordinate artillery barrages over dozens of miles, and maintain contact between rapidly advancing units and their headquarters. German forces, increasingly reliant on outdated communication methods and disrupted by Allied bombing, could not match this level of battlefield coordination. The Red Army's ability to maintain cohesive operational goals across front lines hundreds of miles long depended on these communication systems. By night, German military capabilities were severely degraded. Fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Mechanized divisions lacked vehicles. Infantry units were under strength and often poorly supplied. The contrast with the Red Army, now fully mechanized, well-supplied, and coordinated, was stark. This imbalance was not solely the result of Soviet industrial production or battlefield success. It was deeply connected to the continuous stream of U.S. supplies that reinforced Soviet operations at every level. Lend-Lease did not win battles on its own, but it made the victories possible by preventing logistical collapse during critical phases of the war as Soviet forces crossed into Germany. The impact of Lend-Lease on the strategic direction of the war became undeniable. Without US support, the Soviet Union could have continued to resist, but would have struggled to launch the large-scale offensives that pushed German forces back from Stalingrad to Berlin. The combination of American logistics and Soviet manpower created a partnership that fundamentally shaped the outcome of the Eastern Front. This partnership allowed the Red Army to sustain long offensives, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain pressure on German forces until the final defeat of the Reich. When Berlin fell and the war in Europe ended in May 9, Soviet leaders publicly downplayed the importance of Lend-Lease for political reasons. However, countless Soviet commanders acknowledged privately that without U.S. aid, the war would have lasted far longer and cost far more lives. The flow of trucks, railcars, radio equipment, food, materials, and fuel did not replace Soviet effort. It enabled it. It ensured that the Eastern Front held in 1941 and 1942, that it advanced in 1943, and that it achieved decisive victory in 1944 and 1940-5. In the end, US Lend-Lease did not just support the Soviet Union, it helped determine the fate of the European war. It saved the Eastern Front from collapse, restored Soviet mobility, powered Soviet industry, and provided the logistical means to push to Berlin. Without it, the history of the Second World War and the world that followed would have been fundamentally different.